In this session, we're going to further explore change, teams, and leaders. We'll begin with a summary of the main elements of what we've covered so far about change. And this will be to draw out some of the key issues that need to be borne in mind and acted upon when considering organisational change, so that these issues can be approached thoughtfully and planned for by leaders and managers, not left to surprise us when they appear because we didn't sufficiently think through the implications of making the change. This section won't identify the connections with the main ideas, social changes, themes and writers that we've covered in the classes so far, as this is something you will be expected to do for yourself by reviewing the classes as often as you need to, considering the feedback on your written tasks, and thinking about our seminar sessions and what we've discussed in those. Secondly, we'll explore the creation and use of teams more fully, building on the previous class, and finally we'll consider the implications for what has been covered in the module for leaders. So let's begin by reviewing the main elements that need to be taken into account when approaching a change in any institution. When change may be likely to appear, we need to be mindful of how it may affect each individual's sense of identity. One useful way to think about this is to refer to Maslow's hierarchy of perceived needs and how it considers human motivation. Abraham Maslow was an American psychologist who's best known for his hierarchy of needs, a theory of psychological health based on the idea that innate human needs strongly influence behaviour, and that they do so in an order of priority and culminate, as here at the top of the pyramid, in self-actualization. Maslow stressed the importance of focusing on the positive qualities in people as opposed to treating them. His ideas remain influential today, and evidence for their usefulness can be seen all around us every day in many organisations. As we can see, the hierarchy begins at the bottom, the lowest level, with biological and physiological needs. These are the needs that first and most importantly need to be satisfied by any individual. Maslow then argued that once those needs have been fulfilled, the next set of needs that become important to people are to do with safety, their protection, security, order, law, limits and stability, etc. in their lives. Once people feel comfortable that those needs are sufficiently addressed, they will turn their attention to their needs for belongingness and love, and then to needs for esteem. And these can be reflected in achievement or their personal status or the responsibilities that they hold or the reputation that they have amongst their fellows and peers. And finally, in Maslow's hierarchy, self-actualization is the ultimate fulfilling human motivation need. This is the need for personal growth and fulfillment. To give one example of how these needs might operate, let's imagine that we know an ambitious person. And this person works in an organisation, and they have been extremely busy for the last year working on a huge project plan that they created that's of great personal importance to them and to the organisation, and if it's successful, will reward them with a great increase in status, wealth, and a sense of their personal growth and fulfilment. Now, this individual is therefore operating at or close to the very top of Maslow's hierarchy here. Then, on the morning of an important meeting with senior executives who are about to make the decision about whether the project will go ahead, the ambitious person becomes ill and has to be rushed to hospital, where they are told that they will recover and they'll be well again if immediate surgery is performed, but this will mean that they will be away from work afterwards for 6 months. The doctors say that if the surgery is not performed immediately that afternoon and the 6 months complete rest from work is not taken in full afterwards, the ambitious person may very likely die. Now suddenly, this individual has dropped from the top of Maslow's hierarchy right down to the bottom. They are now completely focused on basic life needs. The important project, the meeting with executives, and the potential wealth and influence suddenly become irrelevant as they are consumed with surviving the operation, staying alive and hopefully becoming well again. This is an example of how Maslow's hierarchy is dynamic and iterative, in that the movement between the levels happens continuously, it's cyclical, and that this happens repeatedly but not necessarily in strict order of priority. It is dynamic. The underlying relationship between the levels reflects their priority order to individuals, but reflects that on a moment-to-moment basis, the way these levels appear is semi-linear as opposed to strictly linear, because circumstances can cause sudden movements between one level and some other level that may not follow the order of priority. In other words, the hierarchy is also contextual. Now, we know from our own personal experience, and we've seen it from theories and ideas we've explored so far, that individuals often feel concerned when changes begin to appear in the workplace because it may affect their perceived status and control. Whether the changes to their status or control of their work and of the work of others are perceived by them, or whether they're perceived this way by other people. Maslow's hierarchy makes it clear why this will be the case. It's because the changes may potentially affect the individual's feelings of fulfillment in the top levels of the hierarchy. So we can see how a perceived loss of status and control is important. Many of the theories and models we've looked at emphasize the need for those who are leading or managing changes that may result in a perceived loss of status or control by individuals, and this is often going to be the case, need to address this because otherwise it could easily become an important and powerful resisting force. So, what should be done? It may be that the worry about possible loss of status or control is misplaced, in which case the leader needs to explain to the individual or individuals affected why they don't need to be concerned. However, if the worry is legitimate, the individual's concerns still need to have it explained to them why the changes are necessary, and ideally to convince them of the need for this, although this may be difficult. Can the organisation do anything to mitigate their loss of status and control? What options are available? Perhaps individuals will have opportunities to be moved to different roles that have equivalent or greater status or control. If this isn't possible, what else can be done? Remember, these individuals could become opponents of the change if their sense of individual self-actualization, their esteem needs and belongingness needs, are not addressed. Maslow's hierarchy stresses that once an individual's biological, psychological and safety needs are met, these other needs become highly important to an individual's sense of self. So, we can determine why the perception is there. The organisation may also be able to identify why the perception has come about, especially if it is a misperception, because incorrect signals or messages circulating in the organisation will be very likely to cause misunderstandings in other places and lead to further problems with other groups of individuals. If the perception isn't wrong, these actions will still be needed, because it may help to identify other individuals who are feeling similar things, but about whom the leadership have not been aware. The same problems will then arise as for the first group, but at least the organisation might avoid leaving some very concerned individuals out of the discussions, which could allow forces opposing the change to go unrecognised and be allowed to grow in strength. So the organisation also needs to be clear about whether any concerns about loss of status or control are well-founded and correct, or whether they are not, and if it's the latter, what the organisation intends to do about this. Clearly, it would be best if potential problems of this sort were identified, thought about, and the responses fully prepared before they arise, rather than having to deal with the problem after it's unexpectedly appeared. The latter situation would be likely to signal to the workforce that either the leadership isn't competent and doesn't know what it's doing because it did not think through the changes properly, or, which is much worse, that it isn't concerned about such things. Now, this last option would send a powerful signal to the workforce that the organisation doesn't care about them, whatever it may now say to the contrary. This, in turn, would make it extremely difficult for the organisation or its leaders to persuade individuals to make the commitment to help them bring about the changes. Communication is therefore of critical importance when trying to bring about organisational change, and this is especially important in organisations where the people who work there are likely to have a very high degree of personal commitment to their professional identity and to obtain strong feelings of self-actualisation from their work, such as will be the case for people like hospital staff, care workers and educators. What is necessary for effective change is therefore for leaders, managers and staff to do things together. This will be very difficult in organisations with a modernist culture, or where the leadership behaves in an autocratic way, and it will not be easy even in organisations that are genuinely consultative and collegial if the organisation is large and can't avoid a degree of compartmentalisation and hierarchy. The organisation needs to eliminate, or at least minimise, the us versus them mentality and give people more encouragement. Here, feelings of vulnerability seem to be present, and where this is so, it is beneficial to determine the source of those feelings, to verify and address them. Whatever the size of the organisation, ensuring that everyone participates in decision-making in some way will be helpful in encouraging people to feel some ownership of the change and how it's implemented. As we've seen so far, most people have an almost automatic fear of the unknown, and change therefore always creates some sense of apprehension and fear because we can't know for sure how things are going to turn out. They may turn out well for us, or they may turn out badly. It's important that the organisation does not hide the truth. If some people may gain and others lose, this needs to be admitted, and good reasons given why it's so. People will need to be convinced that such steps are unavoidable and that the organisation is supporting people accordingly. And one way of demonstrating the need for the change is to try the innovation on a smaller scale. Explaining to people what is going to happen and keeping them informed of progress and why things are being done is also a helpful way of reducing the anxiety people feel. Similarly, people need to be persuaded of the need for the change and not just told it's going to happen, and then be kept informed and continually reminded about why the change is needed and the benefits it will bring, including the benefits to them. If there are no benefits for the people who are going to be very affected by the change, it's quite likely that this task will be impossible, and the degree of resistance and opposition to the change will be high. It's also likely that the change will ultimately fail, so it's important to give more support to help achieve success. This means it's essential to help everyone to understand and, if possible, to accept that the present situation isn't satisfactory and that alternatives need to be found, and that everyone is therefore involved in the consultation. For all the above reasons, it's really important that leaders do not leave anyone out of the consultation and planning. If they do, this will be likely to alienate them, create or strengthen already existing opposing forces, and reduce the likelihood of the change being successful. It's therefore important to remind staff that they are competent professionals, to involve them all and not to rush things, but instead to prolong the time for the change if it's needed, to give people time to adapt and time for them to complete any necessary training. It's also important to recognise that not all staff know or will admit that they need training. Leaders need to emphasise any unique features of the innovation and that it's an experimental experience, that everyone will go through this together. Leaders should also bear in mind that even if they carefully follow all these steps, the chance of things going wrong never goes away, and that, as we've seen before, small things can lead to unexpected consequences. Chaos is the natural condition of things. It's not an unusual state of affairs. Leaders must therefore always be vigilant and pay close attention to the change process, and not assume that once they've conducted a particular step, such as consulting people, they can mark it off as having been finished and don't need to think about it any further. Vagueness can become the enemy of planned change, so it's important to get everyone involved and seek suggestions from everyone. Explain things in detail to people to try to reduce uncertainty and misunderstanding. Define and explain how each individual person has a role to play in the change and that they are clear what that role is. If it's applicable, show how the outside community is affected by the change and will benefit, how it's supportive of the innovation. This is about keeping everyone aware of the big picture, so that they might better appreciate the range of benefits the change will bring, not just inside the organisation, but outside as well. For the same reason, leaders need to seek to reduce any ambiguity and uncertainty about how things are progressing. They should communicate early on at each stage of the change, not only tell people what has happened after it's happened. Progress reports should be issued very frequently so that people can see that progress is actually happening and that the distance between where the organisation was or is at the moment and where it is trying to get to is getting smaller all the time. If this isn't done, people are likely to become disillusioned and demotivated, and more so as more time passes. It's almost impossible to communicate too much when changes are being made in an organisation, but it's very easy to communicate too little. Good communication is essential if everyone in the organisation is to become a follower of the leadership, or better still, a collaborator or a supporter. People need to be reassured that no one will suffer, such for example as being made redundant from the innovation. Again, ensuring that no individuals will suffer from the change is important, but it may not always be possible. And under those circumstances, it is very important that the organisation is seen to be treating those individuals who are affected in that way very well, perhaps by giving generous pay settlements if they are to lose their job because of the changes. It's highly likely that introducing change into any organisation will increase the workload of staff, even if the purpose of the change is to reduce workload in the longer term. Trying to conceal or avoid admitting this will damage the credibility of the organisation, and a much better approach is to show that steps are being taken to minimise this problem. For example, we could try to reduce or eliminate duties that are of low importance during the process of the change. We could make the change less time-consuming. We could reduce the time required to make changes by delegating authority for some aspects of it. It could be very explicit in specifying what work is being allocated and what work is not needed. The organisation could also allow the scheduling of tasks to be more flexible and not follow existing procedures as tightly as is usual. It could ensure that teams are working as effectively as possible. It could hire more staff, even if only on a temporary basis, to relieve the pressure on existing staff who are busy implementing the change. It could offer inducements, rewards, to staff involved in implementing the innovation. These may be inducements or rewards to do with pay, or holidays, or other monetary rewards, prizes, gifts, celebrations, tickets to desirable events, tokens to reduce the price of goods or services, and so on. It could offer public recognition to individuals. These could be formal, titles, pay rises, new offices, certificates, promotions, new roles. Or they could be informal recognition such as personal meetings with and thanks from the president, more free time, honorary access to executive lounges, or simply being named in public statements of thanks. Now, we've heard a lot about the importance of teamwork in organisations, how critical teamwork is, and the processes that teams may go through as part of being formed or when conducting their work. But how can we help to ensure that teams are more likely to be effective? And how can we evaluate the performance of teams to make sure they continue to function as well as possible? In a previous session, we saw how Lewing's force field analysis can be used to identify and evaluate the forces, influences, and powers aligned in support of a change, and also those aligned in opposition to a change. And we also saw from the Elliott-Kemp matrix how individuals in our organisation or team could be placed in different positions in the matrix, and this could help us to develop a strategy for creating a critical mass in favour of our approach. But how should we proceed when constructing a team to undertake a task or change? How should we use a matrix like this one, and using the example of the people shown here, choose who should be in the team? Should we choose to include everybody to make an effective team? Should we choose only those people in favour of the change, such as Simon, Kathy and Margaret? We saw in earlier sessions that this approach might risk suppressing the creative mavericks and dissenting or alternative viewpoints that would provide innovative new ideas. People like Jeffrey or Alan. Our team could become dysfunctional if there were no disagreements. They might be unable to think of potential problems or alternative approaches because they tend to agree with each other all the time. Should we choose people who we think are most like us, or people who are as different to us as possible? Should we choose a mixture of those people? How should we decide what kinds of skills, abilities and people we need in our team to increase the chances that we have chosen the best possible individuals for the task and created the best possible team? One of the ways we could use to build an effective team would be to begin by assessing each individual we might be thinking of including in the team and considering what they might contribute that would be valuable for the task we have in mind. So we might consider their knowledge, their attitudes, their skills, their abilities and characteristics, or other things that we think are relevant and important. Often, the way this is done in industry is to begin by asking each individual to tell us some things about themselves. These will be things we think might be useful to the team, and so we want to know the degree to which each individual believes they possess each of these things. Organisations often use questionnaires for this purpose, and the questionnaires will be designed to identify the extent to which each individual has the positive qualities that are required in the team, and the extent to which they have qualities that will be unhelpful to the team. The results of these questionnaires are often very influential in selecting which individuals will be chosen for a particular role or task or team, or even for whether they are successful in being appointed to a position or not. Self-report questionnaires are very widely used in organisations for things like shortlisting for interviews, the selection of candidates for promotion, for designing training to improve their performance, for assessing the needs they may have for support, or for many other purposes, including, as in our example here, whether they are suitable to become part of a project team that is being assembled. But self-report questionnaires, unfortunately, have some significant limitations. It's not clear, despite their widespread use, whether they are actually useful in identifying the kind of people we most want in the team. Their validity is questionable. Do they do what they claim to do? They can be easily used to skew the selection of candidates to meet the desires of hidden agendas. Despite this, the use of such questionnaires is widespread, and perhaps just emphasises how difficult it is to choose the right people for a role, or a job, or a team. And so organisations use whatever they can to help them select or narrow down the list of people for a particular role. But how will we go about assessing the effectiveness of a team once it's been formed? This problem is made more difficult because of the many different types of team there can be, and not all teams have the same needs, or purposes, or functions. Let's look at cross-functional teams. These, as their name suggests, are comprised of a collection of individuals who have each got different expertise. They're used when these different skills are needed for a particular task and often include people from many different levels of an organisation. So between them, they represent the different areas, the different functions of the organisation. Cross-functional teams are often popular with organisations that want to produce innovation, and so they can be good for breaking up the usual boundaries between different sections of the organisation and minimising the groupthink that might be present in each of them, whilst making sure that each part of the organisation is involved and contributes to the innovation, which is likely to increase their overall involvement and buy-in to any proposal the team makes. Because the individuals in a cross-functional team come from different areas of the organisation, however, it's very likely that they will bring with them the different ways of working that they have and their different processes and different work styles, and these may conflict. The process of creating and leading a cross-functional team must therefore take careful account of the potential that this creates for tensions. So group rules will be needed, along with clear decision-making processes and ways of encouraging good communication and flexibility, so that people can learn from each other, and these differences don't lead to the team becoming dysfunctional. If properly led and managed, cross-functional teams can be highly productive and develop higher engagement of individuals with the organisation's goals. They can develop team building and leadership skills in the individuals involved, and can also be a way of keeping work interesting. Project teams are also a kind of cross-functional team in that they are made up of individuals from different parts of the organisation, but they're different in that they're not intended to be widely representative of the whole organisation. Instead, they're focused on completing the work for an already identified project, as their name suggests. The people in a project team may therefore sometimes include experts from outside the organisation. And the membership of the team might change as different skills are needed at different times in the project as it develops through its various phases. And whilst the project manager may remain throughout the project, in large and specialised projects, the project manager may also change as different leadership skills and experience are needed to lead a particular phase. Project teams can be a powerful way of ensuring that the right skills and experience are available at the right time to complete projects, and they are especially useful if the skills and experience that's needed do not remain the same throughout the project. So for these reasons, project teams are often used in situations which have different phases that need to do different things, such as in large construction projects or in organisations that do many different kinds of work. But project teams, by their nature, can make it more difficult to develop team working because members of the team may often change. And so these teams need to work harder to ensure that trust and collaboration is maintained. The risks in operating a project team is that if it's not done carefully, there may not only be a loss of trust, but additionally more conflict and tension, lower engagement, as people, especially newer members, feel less of a sense of belonging, less efficient information sharing as a result of these things, and less long-term thinking if people are not members of the team for very long, poor change management, especially if the team leader changes for different phases. Super teams are so called, as we might expect, because they are designed to optimise the project of project teams and cross-functional teams, and therefore combine the elements and the downsides of both of the above. Now, which of these kinds of team is used clearly depends a lot on the kind of organisation in which the change is being contemplated. For example, whether it's a small organisation like a small school or a large organisation like a very big school or college. And it's also about the nature of the change and on its specific circumstances. Developing and leading teams is therefore not simple or straightforward, and if things aren't done with the necessary thought, skill and planning, the team is more likely to produce poor outcomes or fail completely or, even worse, make the current situation that led to the team being formed worse, not better, and undermine the willingness of the staff in the organisation to consider or accept any other actions to bring about that change in future. We've seen that Tuckman's model suggests that once any kind of team is created, it will need some time to properly form before it can begin productive work and move to performing. He suggested a number of stages that teams might need to go through before they become effective, and some actions that might facilitate the different stages of that process. But how can we go about selecting the people in our team in the first place? We've just looked at some examples that will help us to think about what kind of team we might need, but are there any ways that we can use to help us select the right individuals? And are there any ways that might be more relevant in an educational setting? Well, we could of course rely on our existing approaches in educational institutions and use application forms, shortlisting and interviews. And we might also be able to draw on our personal knowledge of each of the individuals if they already work in our organisation, and this might help us. But if we're interested in some kind of innovation, where we are seeking to develop new ways to do the things we already do, or to achieve new things that we've not done before, or where we don't really know what things we might need to do to achieve our overarching goal, and we want the team to develop some innovative ideas about these things and then help us to facilitate the process of achieving them, well, then it may be more difficult to know which individuals will be most useful to have in the team, because we'll be asking them to do things that we may not have seen them do before. We may not even know whether they will be able to do any of these new things, or if we think they could do these things, we may not be sure that they can do these things well. So it might be very difficult to know who we should have in the team. And how might we be able to tell whether we have made the most appropriate choices when selecting people? How do organisations deal with such situations and find a way to help them choose the right people for a particular team? And this brings us to one popular approach that is widely used in situations like these. It's not the only approach that's used, so please regard this only as an example of what might be done, even though it is a very popular and widely used approach around the world. I'm referring to the work of Belbin. The underlying principles of Belbin's ideas are taken from psychology and from his work in the 1970s. His ideas are based on the assumption that people matter in a team because they profoundly influence and shape change plans. And he considers teams on the two axes shown here of introversion and extroversion, and anxiety and stability. He argues that because of their makeup, anxious introvert teams can be good at producing ideas but can become preoccupied with their own ideas and thoughts, and they can tend to lack team cohesion. For the same reason, stable introvert teams are good at planning but can be slow to get things done. They can appear indifferent, and they tend to avoid things that seem novel. Anxious extrovert teams are characterized by being dynamic and very entrepreneurial. They enjoy discussion, argument, and debate, but this means they can become easily distracted. They're good in times of rapid change, but at other times their performance can be a bit unreliable. And he argues that stable extrovert teams pull together well and enjoy working in a group. They're versatile, they make good use of resources, but they can become lazy. However, Belbin proposes that any of these pure teams are best avoided, and that mixed teams will function better. And after observing a large number of different international management teams, Belbin and his colleagues came to the conclusion that what was most important in creating an effective team was to consider the behaviour of the individuals in the team. They identified a number of different types of behaviours, and from these developed what they saw as the different team roles that people could have. Each team role was simply a particular tendency for an individual to work with, behave, and relate to other individuals in a particular way. They concluded that each individual person has a tendency to display different team roles to varying degrees, and they identified a number of these different roles. When the team was at risk of becoming too inward-looking and somewhat isolated from the rest of the organisation, the resource investigator or investigators would provide inside knowledge of the people or forces opposing the change, and they'd make sure that the team's work would carry successfully to the world outside the team. Resource investigators tend to be people who are outgoing, enthusiastic, and like to explore different opportunities and develop contacts. They're good networkers, but can sometimes be a little over-optimistic, and so they may lose some focus and interest in things once their initial enthusiasm diminishes, and they may sometimes need chasing up to ensure they follow up on things. Team workers help the team to gel, and they are good at using their versatility to identify what work needs to be undertaken and to complete it on behalf of the team. Now, these individuals tend to be very cooperative and diplomatic in their approach, and they're good at defusing tensions and reducing friction between people. This sometimes makes them a little indecisive because they do not like confrontations, and so they tend to be hesitant about making decisions that are likely to be unpopular. Coordinators are needed in teams to focus their attention on their objectives, to encourage team members and to delegate the work accordingly. They tend to be confident and mature individuals who are good at identifying talent in others and being clear about what goals need to be reached. These characteristics can make coordinators seem a little manipulative at times, and they do have a tendency to offload, or as they would see it, delegate their own share of the work to reduce the amount of work they have to do themselves. The role of the plant was so called because this was an individual who was deliberately planted in a team. These people tended to be very creative and good at solving problems in unusual or unconventional ways. Because these people tend to be imaginative, creative and free-thinking, they're good at generating ideas and solving problems, but they might tend to ignore what they see as details, and they can get wrapped up in their own thoughts and so seem a little uncommunicative, absent-minded, and forgetful at times. The monitor-evaluator role is needed to contribute logical thinking, to make impartial and objective judgments about the team's options where this is required, and to do so in a very dispassionate way. These people tend to be strategic thinkers, and although they tend to be discerning and good at seeing all the options and making accurate judgments about things, they can seem a bit sober and serious and overly critical at times. They may not be very good at inspiring other people or exhibiting drive, and sometimes they can be slow to come to a decision about things. Specialists may be needed in teams that require expertise that other people don't have about technical or legal or other aspects of the work of the team. They can, because of this, tend to be very single-minded, and they're often dedicated to their own area of expertise and so contribute to the team only on a narrow, if important, part of the team's work. Because of this, they tend to dwell on the technicalities surrounding their area of expertise and overload other people in the team with lots and lots of detailed information. The role of specialist is sometimes excluded from studies of Belbin's work, perhaps on the grounds that it's not so much a behaviour like the other roles in the model, but it's more of an additional resource that some teams may need from time to time, but that many teams will not need at all. Don't be surprised, therefore, if you find the research literature sometimes includes and sometimes doesn't include this role, as the sources may still be talking about the same version of Belbin's overall model. Shapers provide the necessary drive to ensure that the team keeps moving and does not lose focus on the task or lose momentum in working towards achieving it. Shapers tend to be quite dynamic individuals who thrive on pressure and have the courage and determination to overcome obstacles. But they can also be a little insensitive towards the feeling of others and can at times be so focused on the team achieving things that they can appear a bit aggressive and bad-tempered when things don't seem to be getting done. Implementers are needed to plan a practical, workable strategy for the changes and the ideas developed by the team and to carry these out as efficiently as possible. They're efficient and they're reliable, and they tend to have a very practical approach to turning ideas into action, and they're good at getting important work organised. But because of these things, they can tend to be a bit inflexible at times and less interested in exploring new possibilities, and this can make them reluctant to change their plans, even when proposals for new ideas seem positive. Completer finishers are most effective when used at the end of a task, where they will polish and scrutinise everything to identify and remove errors. They will subject the work of the team to the highest standards of quality control. These individuals will go to great lengths to ensure that all errors are removed from the work of the team and that its completed outputs are polished to perfection. They tend to worry about things to a degree that other team members might find a little excessive, and they're reluctant to delegate in case this weakens their efforts that are needed to ensure that the work of the team is of the highest possible standard and has no imperfections. These 9 roles describe the main behaviours that Belbin and his colleagues identified in the teams they studied, and claimed that between them they covered the main behaviours required by effective teams in a wide range of different circumstances. Not all the behaviours will be needed in any given team, or even all of the time, and so it will be up to the leaders and managers in an organisation to consider which of these team behaviour roles were most needed, how many of each would be needed in the team, and then to choose the individual members accordingly. And we discuss these ideas a bit further in our seminar classes, but for now, let's hear Belbin himself talking about his ideas.
Well, why do we need to know about Belbin, and how will it help people in the workplace?
I think it's important to understand the underlying reasons for differences between people. We see these differences within a family. They occur at a very early age, and they clearly have a genetic basis because they persist. And our job, I think, is to understand how these can be identified, recognized, and used to advantage in teamwork and in the role that people will play in work situations.
What's different about Belbin?
What is different is that we set out not just to measure how people behave or what their attitudes are. We set out to give people advice on how they can use their personal characteristics to best advantage.
Surely we can all play every role.
Possibly that is so, but on the other hand, it's undesirable. It's more important that we should concentrate on the role that we play best. In that way, we show ourselves to advantage. If we try and play every role, we'll end up undermining the role that other people play, and we'll give them little room and little scope. So if we're going to get good teamwork, we've got to find and choose the best role that we can play in that particular situation.
Can we change?
Well, we can change. The question is it desirable that we change in particular directions? I prefer to think in terms of development rather than change. And if we're thinking of development, we're talking about developing in a direction where we have aptitude and potential. If we change in areas for which we're not fitted, then we expose ourselves and show ourselves to some considerable disadvantage.
Do we need 9 team roles present in a team at all times?
No, because teams have different terms of reference, they have different goals, they have different objectives. And what's more, these goals change as the teams proceed during the course of their project or of the challenges that they face. And if they're going to respond appropriately to these changes, then we need different actors to come on the scheme. We need different roles to be played. Sometimes we need the personnel to change, or at other times people can actually adapt their roles to meet the new demands being placed upon them.
What is the ideal size of a team?
Well, I have my own preferred size. I love a team of about 4 people. Because in a team of 4, there's no hierarchy. When you have odd numbers, one person is naturally there as the arbiter if others don't agree. But with 4 people, it's possible to get a consensus if we have a good balance and understanding of each other in that particular situation. I'm happy enough that teams move up to, say, 6. Once we get beyond 6, I become rather worried because we're moving into the psychology of the group and away from the psychology of a team.
Surely team roles are not applicable in all organisations and cultures?
Yes, that is so. I would not care to introduce teamwork to Afghanistan. There are countries in many parts of the world where regimes are very hierarchical, and for them teamwork is a threat. And yet at the same time, things are changing. I've been working both in Russia and in China, and I've been seeing a gradual movement away from hierarchy to a different form of collaborative human organization. We are in a transitional period, and it's happening in all industries, and I think in all countries to a differing extent. So we need to understand the dynamics of teamwork, how we can use human resources to best advantage, because this is applicable in a general way right across the world, and it's only a matter of time before we see its effects.
The third and final topic we'll consider today is that of leadership itself. Sometimes people seek a distinction between leadership and management. Effective management is often characterized as being good at knowing how to do things right. Effective leadership is therefore more about knowing what the right things are to do. But this distinction is often increasingly unhelpful because today organisations need more and more people in the organisation to do both things. As we saw has happened with the ideas we hold about the way an organisation should best be structured, there has been a move over the past 10 or 20 years from the notion that there is one best way to lead and manage an organisation, and we see some of the most successful organisations in the world adopting different approaches to what is understood by good leadership and management, and what is therefore the most effective way to structure and run an effective organisation. Once upon a time, people developed successful careers by gaining technical, functional or professional expertise. Doing your job well meant having all the right answers, and if you could demonstrate that this was what you had, you would rise up the ladder and eventually move into people management and leadership. And then you'd expect the people working for you to also have the same skills at providing the right answers. As a leader, you knew what needed to be done, so you taught other people how to do it, and you evaluated how well they performed at this. These were what we call command and control organisations, and your aim was to increase the number of people who knew how the organisation worked and could reproduce its previous achievements and successes. In the more developed economies in the world, those days have gone. Rapid, constant and disruptive change is now the norm, and what succeeded in the past is no longer a guide to what will succeed in the future, as the theories of chaos and complexity have taught us. Organisations are therefore increasingly moving away from command and control practices towards something very different. An approach where leaders and managers give support and guidance rather than orders, and where employees learn to adapt to constantly changing environments in ways that produce innovation, creativity and personal commitment. Effective leaders know that they don't have all the answers, so they don't pretend otherwise. The role of a manager or leader is becoming more of that of a coach or a mentor, and it's work that all managers and leaders should engage with in all their people, all the time, in ways that help define the organisation's culture and advance its mission. An effective manager or leader as coach asks questions instead of providing answers, supports employees instead of judging them, and facilitates their development instead of dictating what has to be done. Now, this can be uncomfortable for individuals in leadership or management positions because it means change. And as we've seen already, people find change uncomfortable. And these changes in leadership and management practices are profound. Coaching and mentoring deprives individuals of the security of their authority because their job is no longer about giving orders. Their new role is much more difficult than it looks. It's time-consuming, it requires patience, and it doesn't always work. The work of Covey is most widely known for his book, The 7 Habits of highly effective people, which represents something of a break with traditional ways of thinking about leadership and management, some of which tend to focus on the acquisition and use of technical, instrumental or organisational systems or process approaches. Instead, Covey's approach focused on personal qualities that individuals can draw on in their lives. His work was influenced by the work of Viktor Frankl in his book Man's Search for Meaning. Covey's ideas are not just about leadership and management, but also about life in general, and have been widely adopted in organisations around the world. He advocates that people should focus on making true change within themselves. They should be proactive. What he meant by that was they should take control of their lives and not let the actions of other people define them. Covey argues that without this first achievement, without this first habit, none of the other habits can be developed. We're in charge. We choose the scripts by which we live our lives. We use this self-awareness to be proactive and take responsibility for our choices. Covey argues that what distinguishes us as humans from all other animals is that we can examine our own character. We can decide how we're going to view ourselves and our situations, and to control our own effectiveness. And to be effective, we have to be proactive. Reactive people take a passive stance. They believe the world is happening to them. They say things like, "There's nothing I can do," or "That's just the way I am." They think the problem is out there, according to Covey. But that way of thinking is the problem. Reactivity becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, and reactive people can feel increasingly victimized and out of control. Proactive people, however, says Covey, have the ability to choose how they will respond to a given situation. So in order to be proactive, we have to work on the things we can do something about. Reactive people focus on things that they are concerned about but can't really do anything to change, which leads them to blaming external factors. Covey says we need to begin with the end in mind. This is the second habit. Focus on the future until you make that future a reality. So start with a clear destination in mind and use your imagination to develop a vision of what you want to become or where you want your life to be. And use your conscience to decide what values will guide you. Covey points out that most of us find it rather easy to be busy with everyday things. We work hard to achieve promotion, higher income, more recognition, things like that. But we don't often stop to evaluate the meaning behind this busyness, behind these achievements. We don't often ask ourselves if these things that we focus on so intently are what really matters to us. So he says to change this, we should start with a clear destination. That way, we can make sure the steps we're taking are in the right direction. Beginning with the end in mind is also extremely important for organisations, as we've seen from our earlier classes and discussions. Now, being a manager is about achieving efficiency, but being a leader is about setting the right strategic vision for our organisation in the first place and asking, what are we trying to accomplish? So before we as individuals or organisations can start setting and achieving goals, we must be able to identify our values. We should strive, says Covey, to be principle-centred. Use the unchanging principles, beliefs and values by which we live our lives. And this takes us to the third habit. Covey argues that habit 3 is about prioritising our actions based on what's most important, not what is most urgent. We need to have the willpower to do something when we don't want to do it. We need to act according to our values rather than our desires or impulses at any given moment. Now, we all tend to react to urgent matters, and we often spend time doing things that are not important, but they're urgent. We therefore have to learn how to say no to these other activities, sometimes ones that seem urgent. We also need to be able to delegate effectively to help with this. These first 3 habits are focused on self-mastery and moving away from being dependent on other people and things to being independent and taking charge of our own lives. Covey explains that there are 6 things to consider to create win-win situations, the 4th habit. In win-win, both people win. Agreements or solutions are mutually beneficial and satisfying to both parties. Now, in win-lose, i.e. if I win, you lose, win-lose people tend to use their position, their power, their credentials and their personality to get what they want. In lose-win, I lose, you win, lose-win people are quick to please others and appease them when they seek strength from popularity or acceptance. In lose-lose situations, both people lose. When 2 win-lose people get together, that is, when 2 determined, stubborn, ego-invested individuals interact, the result tends to be that everybody loses. In a win situation, people with the win mentality don't necessarily want someone else to lose. That's not important to them. What matters is that they get what they want. The other option is a win-win or no deal. If you can't reach an agreement that's mutually beneficial, then there's no deal. The best option, therefore, is to create win-win situations. With win-lose or lose-win, one person appears to get what they want for the moment, but the results will damage the relationship between those 2 people. So the win-win or no deal option is important to use as a backup. When we have no deal as an option in our mind, it liberates us from needing to manipulate people and push our own agenda. We can be open and really try to understand the underlying issues. Another important factor that Covey identifies in bringing about win-win situations is maintaining the attitude that there is plenty out there for everyone. Some people find it difficult to share recognition or credit or to be genuinely happy about other people's successes. Covey's 7 characteristics are designed to bring about a type of interpersonal leadership based on our genuine character, which he feels will make us more proactive. And if we are also committed to win-win, the more powerful our influence will be. And to achieve win-win, Covey argues we need to keep the focus on results, not on methods, on problems, not on people. Lastly, the spirit of win-win can't survive in an environment of competition. As an organisation, he argues, we need therefore to align our reward system with our goals and values and encourage cooperation. Habit 5 is about seeking first to understand and then to be understood. Covey proposed that before we can offer advice and suggest solutions or effectively interact with another person in any way, we must seek to deeply understand them and their perspective through what he calls emphatic listening. This is not dissimilar, of course, to Egan's approach to mentoring. In order to solve a problem, we first need to deeply understand it. So Habit 5 says that we must first seek to understand and then to be understood in that order. In order to seek to understand, we have to learn to listen. But we can't simply use one technique to understand someone. And we have to be very careful to be sincere about this, because if people sense that we are manipulating them, they'll question our motives and they'll no longer feel safe opening up to us, and it won't work. To listen, emphatically, requires a fundamental shift for many leaders and managers. We typically seek first to be understood when we interact with people. Most people tend to listen with the intention to reply, not to understand. At any given moment, they're either speaking or they're getting ready to speak. Now, it takes time to make this shift, but it doesn't take nearly as long as correcting misunderstandings or as living with unexpressed and unresolved problems, only to have them surface in a worse form later on. Covey's proposition behind Habit 5 is therefore that when we're able to present our ideas clearly and in the context of a genuine understanding of the other person's needs and concerns, we significantly increase the credibility of our ideas and the likelihood of a good outcome. By understanding and valuing the differences in another person's perspective, we also have the opportunity to create synergy. Synergy allows us to create new alternatives and open new possibilities. It allows us, as a group or individually, to agree to abandon our old habits and approaches and try and create new ones. What we end up with from habit 6 isn't a transaction, it's a transformation. Both sides get what they want, and they build their relationship in the process. By working with a spirit of trust and in an atmosphere of safety, Covey argues that we will prompt others to become extremely open and feed on each other's insights and ideas and create synergy. And synergy allows leaders and managers to value the differences in other people as a way to expand their own perspective. It allows them to sidestep negative energy and look for the good things in other people. And it allows them to develop their own courage to be open and encourage other people to be open as well. So habits 4 and 5 and 6 are focused on developing teamwork, collaboration and communication skills, and moving from independence to interdependence. Habit 7 is focused around renewal and refreshing ourselves spiritually, emotionally and socially, or taking time to sharpen the saw, as Covey puts it. In other words, maintain and enhance our own capacities, our own attributes and our own lives. It surrounds all of the other habits and makes each one possible by preserving and enhancing our greatest asset, ourselves. Covey argues that there are 4 dimensions of our nature, and he thinks that each one must be exercised regularly and in a very balanced way. And the first one is the physical dimension. The goal of continuous physical improvement is to exercise our body in a way that will enhance our capacity to work, adapt and enjoy. So Covey says we should do things like eat well, get sufficient rest and relaxation, exercise on a regular basis to build our endurance, our flexibility and our strength. The second dimension is the spiritual dimension. This is the goal of renewing our spiritual self to provide direction in our life and reinforce our commitment to our own set of values. So, according to Covey, we should do things like practice daily meditation, communicate with nature, immerse ourselves in great literature or music. The third dimension is the mental dimension, the goal of renewing our mental health, and this is to continue expanding our minds. So we should do things like read good literature, maybe keep a journal of our thoughts, experiences and insights. Limit our television watching to only those kinds of programs that enrich our life and mind. And the fourth dimension is what he calls the social, emotional dimension. And this is the goal of renewing ourselves socially, and it's to develop meaningful relationships. And to do that, we should seek to try and deeply understand other people, make contributions to meaningful projects that improve the lives of others, and seek opportunities to help other people find success. Covey argues that if we focus on renewing ourselves along these 4 dimensions, we must also seek to encourage other people to do the same thing. We have to look to inspire others to a higher path by showing them that we believe in them, by listening to them, by encouraging them to be proactive in their own lives. And Covey argues that this process of renewal is what empowers us to move along an upward spiral of growth and change and continuous improvement, which of course echoes some of the ideas of Kaizen in the Japanese approach to management. Habit 7 is therefore focused on continuous growth and improvement, and it draws all the other habits together. Now you should look for articles that support or critique Covey's ideas, and some examples to get you started are uploaded to the portal, but please look for others and don't just rely on those. From the topics and writers we've looked at so far, we can distinguish 4 very broad and generalized approaches or styles of leadership that are commonly found in organizations. We have people who have a concern for the task. We have people who have a concern for people. We have people who have a directive leadership and people who have a more participative approach to leadership. Now, these aren't new ideas. They've been in circulation since the late 1950s, and we've met each of them in various places, and sometimes on more than one occasion, in our exploration in the classes in the module. The truth is that good organisations need leaders and managers at all levels, and are aware that the idea that leadership or management happens only at the top of an organisation or only in certain places is to consider all organisations only as modernist interventions, only as mechanical systems where people tell people what to do and are only concerned with results. And this may no longer be appropriate in a postmodern era. It's more common today to find models of distributed leadership in effective and high-performing organisations that are based on consultative or democratic principles, that are more postmodern, that focus on relationships, that co-determine with people in a democratic way how things are done and also what things are done. In addition to concerns about leadership styles, we can also consider the work of Robert Blake and Jane Mouton, who emphasised two factors that influence a person's leadership style. One is the need for a leader to adapt their behaviour, their style or their methods according to different situations. This, they say, is an important skill and ability. And the other one is the psychological makeup of the leader themselves. And to help leaders and managers understand the effects of these factors, they published their management model in their 1964 book, The Management Grid, The Key to Leadership Excellence. Like other models we've seen, the Blake and Mouton model uses two axes to illustrate their ideas. These are a concern for people and a concern for the task to be undertaken. And Blake and Mouton identified 5 kinds of leadership behaviour and suggested that one of them, the team style, was the ideal. Let's have a look at them one at a time. The first one is the country club style. Now, in this style, the leader has a high concern for and usually a lot of involvement with people, but not a very high concern for the task. There's usually an overly friendly relationship between the leader and the team. So, although leaders like this appear to care about their people and want to create a comfortable and friendly environment, this style isn't often good for creating results. People feel good and happy, but the task lacks priority. Ironically, the group suffers ultimately because they fail to achieve. And this style's common amongst leaders who are afraid of upsetting people and or fear rejection and don't like being disliked. The impoverished style is one where the leader has both a low concern for people and a low concern for the task. Now you might ask who would adopt this approach because it's obviously doomed to fail. Well, the answer is typically leaders who care mainly about themselves and are afraid of making mistakes and being found out. Not surprisingly, Blake and Mouton said this is the least effective approach to leadership. Or we can have a middle-of-the-road style. This is essentially a kind of not very good compromise. There's some concern for the task and equally some concern for people, but we might also say that there's not enough of either. Leaders adopting this approach try to address the needs of the task and of their followers to some extent, but do it without any real conviction or skill or insight, and therefore they tend to reduce their own effectiveness. Leadership generally requires a good degree of natural authority and decisiveness, so a style which lacks these aspects leaves a lot of room for improvement. Then there is the produce or perish style, and here we see a high focus on the task but not much concern for people. This style is often referred to as autocratic. Leaders using this style seek to control and dominate others. A leader like this will commonly take the view that staff should be grateful to be employed and paid a salary. These leaders think they can best generate motivation through a threat of punishment, such as being sacked. This is a dictatorial style. In extreme cases, it would be rightly regarded as being quite ruthless. Sadly, it can be effective in the short term, and, interestingly, where a group is failing to react suitably to a fairly serious crisis, then it may actually be a viable style for a short period, but the approach isn't sustainable, especially where followers have the option to walk away. This approach reflects Theory X, of course, from McGregor, with the leader often operating under the assumption that individuals are naturally lacking in motivation and need an external stimulus to inspire productivity. And finally, the team. This style combines a high concern for and a high involvement in the group, with a strong, well-organised and communicated focus on achieving the task. Blake and Mouton saw this as the ideal behavioural approach. Leaders who behave like this manage to blend concern for both people and organisational aims by using a collaborative teamwork approach, and plenty of consultation, enabling the development of a shared, not imposed, motivation to achieving the organisation's goals. This style normally requires that followers, or the group, are suitably mature and skilled for a high level of involvement. So the style's difficult to use, and may be inadvisable when you're leading inexperienced people to produce challenging and maybe even vital results in a new or strange area. But this theory reflects theory Y in McGregor's work, with the leader often operating under the assumption that individuals are naturally self-motivated and happy to work so long as they are led well and provided with enough freedom to behave in these ways. Now, how can leaders use this model? It's important when contextualising your leadership or managerial style in accordance with the management grid to stay objective. Analyse your individual strengths and weaknesses, and you can begin to plan your personal development with the aim of achieving the ultimate goal as a team leader. You can break down the development process into some fairly simple steps. So you could begin, for example, by identifying your management style. Think about several recent situations when you were required to utilise your role as a manager or a leader. Evaluate how you acted during these situations in accordance with the task and the team members, and position yourself along the managerial grid somewhere. Secondly, you can identify areas for leadership development. So, considering where your results generally centred around, identify the particular style or styles you most closely associate with. Do these suit the context of your role or the situations that were at hand? Thirdly, you could consider the skill or style gaps between you and becoming a team leader. If you believe you are too results-orientated, for example, perhaps begin to include team members in decision-making more often. Improve your communication. Maybe even delegate more responsibility. If the opposite's true and you are strongly person-orientated, maybe work on improving your project management or scheduling skills, or how you clearly communicate roles and tasks. And practice your new skills consistently. Don't allow yourself to fall back into your previous weaker management style. And finally, you could contextualize your grid position based on the situation. The key to the managerial grid is retaining a level of flexibility. Some situations will require most of a results focus than another, and vice versa. For example, if your team's going through a major change, or a new member arrives, it may be more suitable to focus on their needs during this period. But if the organisation is in a phase of uncertainty or struggle, it may be more suitable to prioritise results slightly over the individual need for the time being. Being an effective leader is about knowing your own preferences and behaviours and consciously modifying them to suit the situation in hand, but learning to do so in a sincere way so that your behaviour is genuine and not artificial and false. Transformational leaders specialise in working to change the system and solving challenges by finding experiences that show that the old patterns don't fit or don't work. And they also want to know what has to change and how to maximise their team's capability and capacity. So transactional leaders are expected to set goals and explain what they expect from the organisational members and how they'll be rewarded for their efforts and commitment. Transactional leaders focus on increasing the efficiency of established routines and procedures. They establish and standardise the setting of goals, the efficiency of doing things, and increases in productivity. Transactional leaders exchange tangible rewards for the work and loyalty of followers. That's the transaction, the deal. They are leaders who tend to be more passive, whereas transformational leaders actively try to provide a sense of mission. Transformational leaders are sometimes called quiet leaders. They are the ones that lead by example. Their style tends to use support, inspiration, or empathy to engage followers. They tend to possess quite a lot of courage and confidence and the willingness to make sacrifices for the greater good. The Hersey-Blanchard situational leadership theory is one that's based around leadership that's variable as well, depending on a variety of circumstances, like the previous one. Stage 1 is about telling. It's characterized by one-way communication in which the leader defines the roles of the individual or the group and provides the information about what, how, why, and when and where to do the task. Stage 2 is about selling, convincing. While the leader is still providing the direction, they're now using two-way communication and providing the social and emotional support to allow individuals or the group being influenced to buy into the process. Stage 3 is about participating. This features shared decision-making about how the task is being accomplished and the leaders providing fewer task behaviours whilst maintaining high support for relationships. Stage 4 is about delegating. The leader's still involved in decisions. However, the process and responsibility has been passed to the individual or the group. The leader stays involved, but largely just to monitor progress. And to supplement these 4 leadership styles, this theory also provides 4 maturity levels that describe those who are making up the team in terms of how strongly they're developing the features that are being promoted by the leader at these 4 different stages. So this theory is intended to be used to promote flexible leaders who are able to match their style to the experience and the ability of those they are leading. How to develop and sustain effective leadership has been a fascination of the research literature for many years, and there are many different models seeking to describe, explain, and depict good leadership, what it is comprised of, how to recognize it, how it works, how to enhance or acquire it, or promote and develop it in different organizations and different circumstances. In this module, we've been able to explore only some of the main approaches and have covered elements of the knowledge, skills, and personality factors that contribute to leadership and the management of organizational change. Please continue to develop your own reading in this rich area of research. Although there exists considerable variation in different places and in different settings, the general drift of conceptions and practices adopted towards leadership, management and planning over the last century clearly reflects the social changes that are increasingly visible as different parts of the world become more interrelated, more interdependent, and more globalized. In the 1900s, notions of leadership focused on the idea that these people were some kind of elite. In the 1920s, we saw the rise of scientific management. In the 1950s, this moved towards people and tasks. And in the 1960s, it became more about contingency and contingency management. And in 1970, more about situational leadership. In the 1980s, we saw more interest in transactional and transformational leadership styles and models. And since 2000, we've seen more emphasis on distributed, democratic, and value-based leadership models. This concludes our session. I hope that you found our excursions into some of the main areas of leadership, management and planning in organisations interesting and enlightening, and will find what we have covered useful and helpful in your own professional context.